In 1607, a group of 104 English settlers landed on the banks of the James River in Virginia, planted a flag, and named it Jamestown. Most of us have learned about this in school, and it's basically become America's origin story. But here's what your history teacher probably left out. 36 years before Jamestown, a small band of Spanish Jesuit missionaries landed on the exact same stretch of coastline. They built a chapel, they held mass, and they desperately tried to plant a colony. Then they were almost entirely massacred by the very man they had brought with them to protect them. This is the story of Ajiken, a colony that history has forgotten. A man who might have been two people at once, and a little boy who survived to tell the tale and accidentally changed the entire course of American history. To understand Ajiken, you need to understand what Spain desired from the New World, and more or less what Spain was afraid of. By the 1560s, Spain had already struck gold, literally. They had conquered the Aztec and Incan empires, stripped them of their wealth, and were shipping it all back to Europe by the boatload. The Spanish treasure fleet, massive convoys of silver and gold, sailed north through the Florida Straits each and every year. But there was a big problem. Pirates, namely French pirates. They had developed a charming hobby of intercepting treasure ships and plundering whatever was on board. Spain's solution was to fortify the coastline. They needed ports, settlements, lookout stations, and refueling stations, all the way up the eastern seaboard. They pushed north, building Santa Elena in present-day South Carolina, and then, in 1561, one of their ships got very lost. A Spanish caravel named the Santa Catalina, captained by a man named Antonio Velasquez, was blown off course and sailed into the vast, magnificent bay the Spanish would call the Bahia de Santa Maria, what we now call the Chesapeake Bay. Now, Velasquez did what any good imperial captain would do in this situation. He looked around, took stock, and decided that this was a strategic waterway, and then kidnapped 2 locals. This was the 1560s, and this was how the Spanish Empire operated. One of the captives was a young man of about 17, the son of Warrants, a local Algonquin chief from the area the Spanish would name Ajiken. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to him, and honestly, neither did Velasquez. What followed was one of the most extraordinary journeys any human being undertook in the 16th century, and almost nobody knows about it. The young Algonquin was taken across the Atlantic to Seville, Spain, then the beating commercial heart of the Spanish Empire, a city overflowing with American silver and incense and imperial ambition. Then south to Cordoba, then to Madrid. And in Madrid, the 17-year-old boy from the Chesapeake Bay had an audience with King Philip II himself. At this time, Philip was the most powerful monarch on earth, the man who would later send the Spanish Armada against England, and across the table from him, a teenager from the unknown wilds of Virginia. Philip was intrigued. Here was a native from an unexplored northern coast who could serve as an interpreter, diplomat, and guide for any future missions. The young Algonquin, for his part, seems to have understood exactly what was expected of him and played his role beautifully. The plan was a brief stop before returning to Virginia with Dominican missionaries. Instead, he fell gravely ill. Near death, he consented to baptism, which, according to the Dominican friar watching over him, produced an immediate, miraculous recovery. We'll never really know. What we do know is that when he recovered, he took the name Don Luis de Velasco, named after the Viceroy of New Spain, his powerful patron, and the Dominicans' original mission was canceled. Don Luis would spend the next several years studying Spanish and theology in Mexico City. Then, in 1566, a new expedition was organized. Don Luis, 2 Dominican friars, 15 soldiers were heading home at the very long last. Unfortunately, the small expedition became completely lost. They sailed too far north, then overcorrected south, and never found the Chesapeake Bay and turned around. Some in the crew blamed Don Luis for deliberately steering them astray. We may never know, But what we do know is Don Luis ended up back in Europe for another 4 years, now studying with the Jesuits in Seville. By the time we next hear of him seriously planning to return home, it is 1570. He has been away from Ajican for 9 years. He has met a king. He has crossed the Atlantic 4 times, nearly died, and converted to Christianity, or at least appeared to. And now he's returning home with Jesuits. Father Jean Bautista de Segura was the Jesuit vice provincial of Havana, Cuba, essentially the head Jesuit for the entire region. He was, by all accounts, a deeply sincere but idealistic man. He had recently withdrawn Jesuit missionaries from Georgia and South Carolina, frustrated by their lack of progress. But now he had a bold new plan. Here was the plan. Go to Ajican, then colonize the northern coast, establish a mission. But no soldiers, no military escorts, and no forts. Just a small group of priests, some faith, and Don Luis. His superiors had numerous concerns. Pedro Menendez de Aviles, the governor of Spanish Florida, had been arguing for years that you absolutely must have soldiers to protect missionaries in the wilderness. No soldiers, they kept saying, and then more soldiers would follow back. Segura, however, waved him off. Don Luis was their protection. He was their key. And with him, they could win the hearts of the Algonquins through faith alone. No weapons and no coercion. On August 5th, 1570, Father Segura set out from Havana with his party. They briefly stopped to resupply at Santa Elena, the Spanish outpost in South Carolina, then continued northward into the unknown. On September 10th, 1570, they landed on the shore of the Chesapeake Bay. What they found, however, was disturbing. The land was in the grip of a 6-year drought. Villages they expected to find had been abandoned. Crops had failed, people had moved, and only a handful of men remained in some of the settlements. They told the priests that they had stayed simply so they could die where their fathers had died. The Jesuits, on the other hand, had only brought minimal supplies. They had expected Don Luis to navigate them to a friendly reception, food, shelter, and community. Instead, they found something much closer to a wasteland. For the first few days after landing, Don Luis helped the Jesuits establish their small mission, essentially a 2-room wooden structure, one serving as a chapel for Mass, and the other as a living quarters. He appeared at least engaged, present, and helpful. And then, within a week of arrival, he vanished. He said he was going to visit his family, that he would gather food, and he would be back soon. But he never returned. The Jesuits, now stranded on the Virginia Peninsula in the middle of a famine, with no interpreter, no military protection, no political connections to the local people, and dwindling supplies, were running out of options. The winter of 1570 to 71 was brutal. They got sick, were desperately hungry, and the local Kiskiak people gave them food out of what sounds like basic human decency, but this further strained the relation. Meanwhile, Don Luis had returned to his family and, by most accounts, resumed his previous life with remarkable speed. He took multiple wives. He re-engaged with Algonquin customs he hadn't practiced in a decade, and whatever Christianity he had carried across the Atlantic Ocean was, it seems, cast aside. The Jesuit brothers sent to find him, to beg him to return and translate, suggests that Don Luis initially came back briefly, dressed in European clothes, and then left again. Father Segura, as a last-ditch effort, sent 3 Jesuit brothers to Don Luis's village one final time. They carried some small items, axes, a few tools, other valuables, as gifts, or enticements to come back. The brothers were killed upon arrival. Don Luis has sent a larger group back to the mission. Father Segura and the remaining Jesuits were warned. Local people tried to alert them. Whether the warning was unclear or whether Segura refused to believe it, we may never know, but the missionaries were slaughtered. Most of them, anyways. Only one was spared, Aloncito, little Alonzo. Nobody knows exactly why. He was young, a boy, not a priest. He was not yet a Jesuit. He was perhaps not seen as a threat, Or there was simply mercy extended to a child. Whatever the reason, the local community kept him alive. For over a year, Alonso lived among the people who had killed his companions. He learned their language, and he survived. In August 1572, a Spanish relief ship finally arrived in the Chesapeake Bay. The crew saw figures on the shore wearing priest robes. They thought everything was fine. Things were not fine. The local people had taken the robes, possibly, scholars suggest, as a way of appearing to be missionaries to ward off any suspicious Spanish ships. The ship's crew eventually realized something was wrong, and a tense standoff began. Alonso managed to signal the ship, was rescued, and rushed back to Florida. He would then tell the entire story. The Spanish response was swift, and by the standards of the time, somewhat restrained. Though restrained might be a relative word when you're talking about a military expedition hunting down the people responsible for killing 8 priests. In the spring of 1572, Pedro Menendez de Aviles, the governor who had previously warned Segura about not bringing soldiers, personally led a punitive expedition to Ajican. He was not in a charitable mood. The Spanish captured a number of men they believed to be responsible for the killings, held a trial, and hanged several of them on the ship's rigging as an example. But Don Luis himself, he was never found, never captured, and again simply vanished from Spain. The records last mention him in 1572. And this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Though there is no historical consensus, some historians have argued that Don Luis did not simply disappear. They argued that the Algonquin man who returned to his people in 1571, having spent 9 years absorbing every detail of Spanish imperial ambition and military strategy, later reemerged under a different name. That name, Ope. Ope was the most powerful war chief who became the most formidable Native American opponent of the English at Jamestown. He directed the Massacre of 1622, a coordinated attack on English settlements across the James River that killed nearly 400 colonists in a single morning. He tried again in 1644, in his 90s, nearly blind and so frail that he had to be carried on a litter, and was finally captured by the English, brought to Jamestown as a spectacle, and shot in the back by a guard. Was Ope the same man as Don Luis? Did he spend 9 years at the heart of the Spanish Empire, return home, drive out the Spanish, and then spend 40 more years driving out the English? Anthropologists say probably not. The timelines are just too tight. The tribal affiliations don't quite line up, and 2 people can't really be in different places at the same time. But other historians searching for answers have asked the question, who else would have understood Europeans so deeply? Who else would have known that more would always come? And who else could have organized such precise, sophisticated resistance? The records just don't tell us. Paquiquineo, or Don Luis, simply walks off the edge of the historical page and disappears. One of the most remarkable beings of the 16th century, and we lose him to vanishing in the Virginia woods in 1570. After the Ajican disaster, Spain quietly withdrew from the Chesapeake. The region was simply too hostile, too difficult, and too costly to hold. Governor Menendez explored the bay again in 1573, but there was never another serious attempt at settlement. And so the most strategically valuable stretch of coastline on the eastern seaboard, a massive sheltered bay with rich fisheries, navigable rivers, and extraordinary agricultural potential, was effectively left open. In 1587, the English tried to take Roanoke Island, just down the coast, and we all know how that ended. Or rather, we don't, because they vanished too. But in 1607, the English tried again at Jamestown, and this time they stayed. And the rest, this incredibly consequential, enormously complex, deeply painful rest, is American history. Here's the thing, though. If the Spanish had succeeded at Ajican in 1570, and if Don Luis had stayed, and if the mission had held, and if Segura had brought soldiers, the stretch of Virginia coastline would have been Spanish territory by the time the English showed up. Virginia, might have been Nueva España. The entire colonial history of North America would have changed, and the 13 colonies most likely would not have existed in their current form. The United States as we know it might never have formed. One man, at the right moment, in one desperate February in 1571, changed the history of an entire continent, and he's largely forgotten to the. And one more mystery. The mission site has never been found. Archaeologists know it was somewhere near the York River, probably close to a Kiskiak village near what is now the Yorkton Naval Weapons Station in Virginia. Anthropologists have led excavations of the area, and historical markers exist, while researchers have theories, but no physical trace of St. Mary's mission. No crosses, no foundations, no artifacts definitively linked to Segura's party have ever been found. The Catholic Church has not forgotten the event. The Ajican martyrs have been designated servants of God, the first step towards potential beatification, a process that, as of 2025, is still moving slowly through the Vatican. Somewhere in the tidewater soil of Virginia, beneath centuries of history, the remains of 8 Jesuit priests and the ashes of the first European settlement in the region may still be waiting to be found. So why does this even matter? Why dig up a failed colony from 1570 that most Americans have never heard of? It matters because of Don Luis. Here was a man who, depending on which historian you might believe, either kidnapped or convinced to board a Spanish ship at the age of 17, was taken to the most powerful imperial court on earth, learned Spanish, Latin, and theology, navigated the courts of Mexico City, Havana, Seville, and Madrid, and used every tool at his disposal, including, possibly, a very well-timed illness, to delay, redirect, and eventually return home with enough strength to lead his people against the Spanish. Spain chronicles him as a traitor, a deceiver, a man who took the gifts of baptism and civilization and paid them back in blood. And yes, 8 men died. But from another angle, here was a man who had seen firsthand the European colonization did to indigenous people, who had watched the Spanish dismantle civilizations in Mexico and the Caribbean, who understood, perhaps better than anyone else, exactly why a Jesuit mission could be the leading edge of it, and he stopped it by any means necessary. The Ajican colony is forgotten. The martyrs are mostly unknown outside of Catholic scholarly circles. The boy, Aloncito, who survived and told the story, lived a quiet life in Florida and faded from record. But that empty stretch of Virginia coastline, uncolonized and waiting, eventually became the place where 2 different empires tried their luck. And from that second attempt, a nation was born. And it all traces back to a man named Don Luis, standing on a cold Virginia shore in 1571, making a brutal decision. And if you thought this was wild, the story of Opé's later battles with the English at Jamestown are just as fascinating. I'll put some links in the description, and also check out James Horne's book, A Brave and Cunning Prince. It's perhaps the best modern treatment of the whole saga. Subscribe, please hit that bell, all that usual stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.